a todos e todas. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao terceiro evento na nossa série BRICS na Conjuntura Internacional, BRICS in the International Conjuncture and International Politics. É um prazer enorme estar aqui hoje com dois convidados muito especiais para discutir um tema da maior importância, do maior interesse do nosso público brasileiro e internacional. Né? A situação da pandemia no continente africano chamou muita atenção das organizações internacionais, Fundo Monetário Internacional, Banco Mundial de forma geral. A preocupação com o acesso à vacina e o impacto da pandemia nos países africanos, no continente africano, foi tema de vários debates internacionais, no âmbito do G20, das organizações internacionais em modo geral. E agora, por sua vez, a distribuição das vacinas, o acesso às vacinas, o acesso à produção das vacinas e, posteriormente, o acesso à própria aplicação delas vem sendo muito debatido. Então, hoje aqui temos dois especialistas para falar do tema. Eu fico muito contente, muito feliz em tê-los aqui. Vou apresentá-los em inglês. So I will now switch to English to welcome everyone who is here. I'm really, really glad to welcome here two of the main specialists, activists, scholars on issues of intellectual property right, on fight for human rights, fight for the access to medicine. So I'm very, very glad to have here Professor Vishwas Satgar. Let me just present you with all the information that I have. Vish, thank you so much for being here this afternoon and evening, right, to you in South Africa. Professor Vishwas Satgar is Associate Professor of International Relations and also the principal investigator for emancipatory future studies in the Anthropocene at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's the editor of the book series Democratic Marxism, a veteran activist. He chairs the board of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. He's the co-founder of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Climate Justice Chapter process. And he has recently convened the Global Assembly Stand with Africa, Safe and Effective Vaccines for All, Healthcare and Frontline Workers of the World Unite. So Vish, thank you very, very much for being here with us. He will talk about what he calls the geopolitics of vaccine and the situation of the pandemic in Africa, in South Africa, and the role that South Africa has played very recently in the WTO in the fight against intellectual property right and the fight for access to the vaccine. And after we hear the talk from Professor Vishwas Satgar, we have the comments from Pedro Villardi. Pedro Villardi is the coordinator of the Working Group on Intellectual Property Right of the Brazilian Network of People's Integration. He's project coordinator of the Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS, HIV Association, ABIA. Pedro has a degree in international relations, a master's degree in bioethics and applied ethics, and a PhD in human science and health at UERJ. And Pedro has been working on the topic of medicine, pharmaceutical patents, global health for more than 10 years now, and has been, for all these years, very close to the BRICS Policy Center. So for the public who is here, we will hold this in English, but there is translation. You can just press on interpretação on your right, and then you can choose either Portuguese, English, or off, so without translation. Please feel free to comment, ask questions, pose your comments on the Q&A. Also on your right side, you can do it in Portuguese or in English. If you do it in Portuguese, I will be happy to translate and have your comments, your questions, both to Professor Vishwas or to Pedro. So now, please, Vish, you're very welcome. I'm very happy to have you here, very honored and happy to have you here.
Well, good evening. from South Africa, and I'm sure it's early, it's afternoon in Brazil. And thank you to Anna and colleagues at the BRICS Center for hosting this event and inviting me. And I'm also really honored to share this platform with Pedro as well. I have a slide presentation, so I'm just going to dive straight into it. So, I mean, just to give a snapshot of where we are at the moment, going back to January 2020, the alarm bell was rung around a public health emergency by the World Health Organization. And by 11th of March, we were all suddenly in a state of exception. A global pandemic was declared and all our lives ground to a halt. A very small pathogen literally gridlocked the global economy, countries, and of course, all our lives. Fast forward to the present, and the world is experiencing in the plural third waves, and in some places actually fourth waves. And we are seeing the global spread and the dominance of the Delta variant. Confirmed cases globally, according to the World Health Organization, at about 1.8 billion. New cases, 361,149. Excess deaths, about 4 million. And of course, the number of vaccine doses administered globally at about 2.9 billion. So this is just a kind of snapshot of the context and where we're at. Africa is going through a third wave. And the third wave has higher infection rates, higher hospitalization rates, and it is spread more widely on the continent compared to the previous two waves. There are few countries that are hotspots on the continent, particularly South Africa, and I'll say more about that just now, but there are other countries as well, Tanzania, Uganda, Egypt, etc. And this time around, you can see the kind of failures of neoliberalized economies, the so-called good governed and disciplined economies over 3 decades of neoliberalization, and how they've completely undermined healthcare systems and so on, including in South Africa. So all of this is being revealed, and Africa is being hit hard at the moment. In South Africa, the situation mirrors, or rather reflects, what's going on the continent. We have almost 2 million confirmed infections. Our death rate is close to 60,000 or more now. Our excess deaths are way over 150,000. We are in a third wave with higher infection rates, higher hospitalization rates compared to the previous 2 waves we've had to endure. Again, very similar to Brazil and other countries, healthcare system being tested. We went into this pandemic with about 1,300 ICU beds in our public healthcare system, wholly inadequate. Almost 90% of those beds inside ICU beds, mainly in the private sector, serving 9 million medical aid recipients. So we really went into this pandemic with a highly unequal healthcare system. So in this context, it's important for us to kind of reflect on the whole issue of vaccines. And given that the pandemic has inaugurated a whole new conjuncture, ruling classes were forced to reinvent how they ruled. They were forced to rethink how they govern societies, economies, and publics, and so on. And in this context, it's blatantly clear that there's a fault line that's running through our planet. And the World Health Organization captures this very well in terms of its complete abhorrence of the imbalance in the distribution of vaccines on a planetary scale. Now, most of you, I'm sure, in this audience are aware of the inequality that exists. If you look at the high-income countries, we know the story. They bought out global supply. They can vaccinate their populations twice over. 87% of doses have been given in wealthier countries, but yet 0.1% of people have been vaccinated, largely in the global south. So the inequality is very stark. In the context of Africa, it's actually a racialized dynamic, and this is what we are dealing with. And it is rather shocking because behind the whole vaccine challenge is the money-making machine. I mean, these were pharmaceutical corporations. Many of them kind of jump-started also in the context of COVID, not necessarily the big pharma corporations, but overnight becoming billion-dollar corporations. And Oxfam did a very important study on this, showing how in most of these leading vaccine developer corporations, we now have a new strata of billionaires. So there's been intensive class formation, and there's a list here of the infamous, if you like, but they have a combined wealth now of about $19 billion, enough to vaccinate all people in low-income countries, 10% of the world's population, 1.3 times. So if the vaccines were not in the grip of pharmaceutical capital, we would have been able to reach way more people on the planet. We would have had the resources to do it as well. So this is happening in the context in which there's been a crisis of US hegemony and leadership in the world, a crisis of capitalist civilization, and a world in a global transition. The pandemic hit when the US was really in a state of crisis. The financialized neoliberalization of the global economy inaugurated a big crisis in 2007, 2009, and the global economy hasn't fully recovered from that, despite the role of China and so on. You've had resource peak, oil peak, for example, by the mid-2000s. You had the overshoot of planetary temperature, 1 degree Celsius increase since pre-industrial revolution around 2015. So big problems, big systemic crisis tendencies, which the US was failing to deal with, and actually was the cause in many respects, or major contributor to. So you had a ruling class in the United States that basically was propelling the world deeper and deeper into capitalist civilization. The rise of Trump further deepened that crisis trajectory. So this is the context in which COVID-19 registers as a conjunctural shifting development and challenging, as I said, modes of ruling and governing, etc. So in this context, the very interesting question about where to for US leadership in the context of this pandemic. And this is a relational issue because it relates also to the BRICS, which I'll get to just now. So is the US, particularly under the Biden administration, now inaugurating a third hegemonic cycle of leadership in the world? Well, it's early days, but there's some very important moves that have been made. So the April 22nd Earth Summit is very interesting in how the Biden administration upstaged, particularly China, around the climate question. And it placed an ambitious climate agenda at the forefront of the world's leadership. Now, this was a break with the Trump leadership. This was a break, by the way, with over 2 decades of American leadership vis-a-vis the climate problem and the multilateral negotiation process. And there's a lot we can talk about this, but just to say that that is an attempt now to position the United States at the forefront. But there was an irony in that summit, because while the Earth Summit was happening, the Biden administration was rolling out vaccines that it had bought out to its own population. So a vaccine nationalism was looming large. And so there was a hypocrisy in this call for us to have a collective approach to the climate problem, but yet at the same time, when it came to the pandemic and the vaccine rollout, well, vaccine nationalism loomed large. At the same time, the G7 summit recently was very interesting. Again, another move by the United States, the Biden administration, its agenda around Build Back Better, kind of signaling to the world that there's a potential for a kind of more modest Marshall Plan, a kind of rival to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this time around, attempting to think about infrastructure, but also the vaccine challenge in a more serious way. So what's coming to the fore increasingly is a kind of liberal imperial agenda and approach. kind of to use cooperation and multilateralism on global problems, competition on supply chains, particularly with China, but also to kind of flag the human rights kind of challenge. And so the US has been lining up and realigning the West, if you like, around its leadership with the Biden administration. There are various limits here, particularly domestic dynamics in terms of, well, there's a 2-year window before the midterm elections, and the balance of power could easily shift in the US Congress. But you also have opposition growing and building to Biden's infrastructure agenda and so on. It seems like there's an upending of some of the key tenets of neoliberalism in the US right now, but it's still uncertain. But this feeds into the geopolitics of vaccine apartheid. So Trump and the Western governments tied up global supply, and they invested heavily to jumpstart, as I said, a lot of these vaccine manufacturers, et cetera, and pumped in billions of public finance into these technologies and companies. But at the same time, India and South Africa, since October last year, pushed hard for a TRIPS waiver in the WTO, thinking that if this could be leveraged, and there was a precedent here around HIV/AIDS, then this could give the global South an opportunity to crank up production. Russia and China, in this context, have largely played vaccine diplomacy with their vaccines, and they are not stepping up to present their vaccines as a global public good. Yes, these may not be the mRNA vaccines, but still, they're not showing a commitment to, if you like, a global commons around vaccine knowledge, technology, etc. In the context of Africa, Chinese vaccine suppliers are busy tying up contracts, and it's not very transparent, but there's money being made in its relationship with numerous African countries. South Africa just approved the Sinovac vaccine as well. In this context, the Biden administration has changed the game, particularly his trade representative, Catherine Tai, and her push with his support for a waiver in the WTO process. So this is a very, very important development. And in the context of where we are sitting with Africa, well, it speaks to the challenge. Africa has 25% of vaccine supply to be covered by COVAX, and the African Union will provide another percentage, but the vast majority of 64% of the African population will not have vaccinations in 2021. So with variants coming, the third wave hitting Africa, this is a dire situation. So if you look at sort of death rates and so on, and I pull this off the Financial Mail, it's very striking that Brazil has been hit hard amongst the BRICS countries. I don't need to tell you that, and you've been living that experience. And of course, India has had a hit as well, and you see it in the April to kind of July period of this year. Russia has had it bad as well, and South Africa. But again, you have flatline China, and I don't know what to make of this data, actually. This is a perfect country. It's not impacted by COVID-19, but the other BRIC partners are, and they've been devastated by it, which raises questions about what earth is the BRICS all about, okay? And it becomes even more stark when you look at vaccinations. Basically, the West or the global North, whatever, is leading the race in terms of vaccinations for reasons I've explained. China is close. But then if you look at other BRICS partners, they're really, really lagging behind. Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, the worst, actually. Our vaccine rollout is really moving at snail's pace, despite our third wave and so on, and other complexities around it. But the government has generally failed. So again, it prompts the question, is there a coherent BRICS response to COVID-19? And are BRICS partners working together? I mean, why isn't Brazil where China is? Why isn't Russia, India, and South Africa where China is? You can ask that question. It's a legitimate question. But clearly there's an incoherence, there's divergence, and there's contradiction at work in the BRICS bloc when it comes to COVID-19. Again, it looks very stark. The Financial Mail uses the language of advanced economies versus emerging and developing economies. But nonetheless, you can see the stark divide. And you can see where the rest of the BRICS partners are in relation to both China and, of course, the so-called advanced economies. But again, what we got to keep in view is that if we are going to overcome this current crisis, the impasse around vaccines and vaccine supply and vaccine apartheid, we have to locate in our perspective where resistance and struggle is. And over the past 3 decades, we've had 3 cycles of resistance, and I'm not going to get into that, but we are in a 4th cycle of resistance. And it's this context that we can, if you like, rise to the challenge of ending vaccine apartheid. And a lot has been happening, and a lot is being. So if you look at the past few months, from the Pope on one hand to various Nobel laureates, various global NGOs from Oxfam, the People's Vaccine Campaign, including Biden, and various musicians and celebrities, etc., have come out against vaccine apartheid. And they have shifted the narrative and the global discourse. It's in that context also on the continent, we hosted an assembly around standing with Africa, safe and effective vaccines for all healthcare and frontline workers of the world unite. And we held this global assembly with all the leading global union federations in the world, the GAFs, all the leading civil society organizations in South Africa, the Frontlines, including the People's Vaccine Campaign and others, all our trade union movements in South Africa. And on this platform, we said we have to learn lessons from the HIV/AIDS struggle. India and Brazil taught us very, very powerful lessons in this regard, in securing ARVs, generic manufacturing, common pooling of technology and knowledge. And South Africa caught up with this through our own treatment action campaign, etc. But learning lessons from these countries and pushing hard. And so we felt with that precedent and that lesson, we can push hard against vaccine apartheid. And we rallied on this platform to transmit this message, including to the WTO and so on. And we've been having a dialogue with them as well. And so on the 8th of June, there was a WTO meeting to kind of start the process of further giving flesh to the idea of a waiver, a TRIPS waiver. But there is contestation in the WTO process. And I'm sure Pedro can say more. The EU, for example, particularly the European Commission, is very much about increasing the supply and the protection of patents. There's a clear fault line and divide there with the United States. This is contra the European Parliament, in which the left has secured a resolution for a waiver. So there's a tension there, and there's contestation, and there's a battle going on as well. The US wants this waiver, as I've said, but of course, it's not clear around certain specifics. Where Russia, China, and Brazil stand, again, is not very clear. And maybe Pedro and others in this conversation can enlighten us. But it's not as though the BRICS bloc is acting together to secure global public good and to move the global public in a progressive direction. South Africa and India have been consistent, and the big debates are about scope. Is it just vaccines, but is it also other therapeutics, diagnostic technologies, etc., that should be locked into this waiver? Also the question of duration. Is it just a question of 2 or 3 years? Is it a question of 5 years for this waiver to apply? So there's some big debates here, and given variance and the changing nature of this pandemic, these are very, very important questions. So finally, to conclude, this analysis for me foregrounds challenges for the BRICS. It's clear that the BRICS have not had a vision and an agenda for a new world order. They've been caught up in the dynamics of global rivalry in many respects, and they have failed to address numerous systemic crises, the financial crises, a resource peak, the climate crisis. So there's a very stark incoherence in the so-called BRICS configuration. And of course, this is consistent in relation to a response to COVID-19 and the TRIPS waiver. There's a lack of a coherent response, common agenda, and so on. In this context, there are hard questions also to be asked vis-a-vis China, particularly around the origins of COVID-19. I think the Trump approach was wrong. It was racist. I think also the Biden administration is pointing fingers, but I think there's a need for a different approach to the question of the origins of COVID-19. And this is about the global public interest. China has responded to the G7 meeting saying, well, a group of countries can't dictate to the world. Multilateralism is important. Well, if China is true to its word, then it will allow the World Health Organization to reach certain objective conclusions on the origins of COVID. So the world can learn lessons from this experience. At the same time, China and Russia need to move beyond sort of vaccine diplomacy and building legitimacy and political capital and currency, and beyond commercial transfer of technology. And they really need to think about stepping up and advancing vaccines as a global public good, and to share their knowledge, their technology as part of vaccine development hubs. Now, South Africa is sitting in a very interesting situation in relation to this. Despite its position in the WTO process around a waiver, a TRIPS waiver, in practice, it's a contradictory position. And there are two, if you like, initiatives inside the country that are contradictory. On the one hand, you have Aspen, which is a pharmaceutical company in South Africa, just locking into a $10 billion loan through Macron and supported by European governments and so on, and to lock in to transfer around the J&J vaccine. But this is really about royalties. It's about protecting intellectual property while sharing some of the technology and know-how. This is what the European Union wants. And this company in South Africa, of course, has got the nod from the South African government. And this is, again, the kind of epidemiological neoliberalism of the South African state, which wants foreign direct investment to come in. And so, again, it's giving a nod in this direction. At the same time, the South African government has just secured with the World Health Organization the commitment to an mRNA vaccine development hub. And this is linked to the medicines patent pool, which produced 13 HIV ARVs, generics through pooling and so on. And this is linked to our universities, and it's linked to a state-run corporation called BioVac. And there's potential here to move in the direction of a public good, a decommodified commons approach to the vaccines. So in this context, of course, the struggle continues. And it's very, very important that in each of our countries, we amplify and intensify the struggle to end vaccine apartheid. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very, very much, Vish. It was really, and I have many questions, but I think that I will let Pedro talk first. It was all very, very interesting. I will say just something in Portuguese for the public to put their questions in our Q&A. Vou falar aqui em português, mais uma vez, só para deixar claro, né? Bem-vindos a todos e todas que estão aqui na sala, participando aqui da sala do Zoom. E à vontade de colocar suas questões na barrinha Q&A aqui abaixo do seu lado direito. Podem fazê-lo em português, se ficarem mais à vontade, a gente traduz. So, Pedro, it's up to you now.
Okay, thank you, Ana. Again, thank you to the BRICS Policy Center for this invitation. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Very, very insightful. I had my graduate degree in PUC-Rio, so I kind of feel home being in this space. It's good to be back and to try to share some comments in regards to the professor's presentation. So I was trying to raise some topics that I thought that would be interesting for me to comment after the professor's comments. So the first thing I would like to comment is to take a little bit of what he said in terms of how the health systems were dismantled during several neoliberal governments throughout the years. I think that happened in our region in Latin America, but it also happened in the African continent. And when I look at the so-called recovered people, these huge figures, it doesn't brings comfort. It actually brings tons of worry, because we are seeing that long COVID is a reality, and the people who have COVID, they will need months and months and maybe years of very specific care. And we are looking here at a huge burden put on the health system that are being dismantled by neoliberal policies, that are already overwhelmed by other diseases and other what we are calling the political determinants of health, not just the social determinants of health, the political determinants of health. So this will be a huge challenge for the world to deal over the next couple of years. The COVID survivors, they will need significant amount of care, and the systems are not ready to deliver this kind of care that those people will need. So we need to really start a conversation on how can we strengthen those health systems, and that necessarily we need strong state action and state funding, and we will need to tackle those neoliberal policies, because it's incompatible to have this kind of macroeconomic orientation and the level of care that we'll be needing for the next couple of years. It was a very interesting contextualization, and I think it's interesting to think about the COVID in terms of the BRICS, especially because of this proposal that was put in WTO by South Africa and India. But before that, just a quick comment that I think we need to look at COVID, but also look at other health emergencies that we have lived in the last 2 decades. So 3-4 decades actually. So we need to think about HIV, we need to think about hepatitis C, we need to think about H1N1. It's a fact that not everyone is familiar with, but Brazil was one of the countries that have put significant amounts in developing a vaccine for H1N1. And this vaccine was very important to stop the pandemic before it actually became a pandemic. But anyway, Brazil could only start vaccinating its own population 8 months after the European vaccination campaign started, even if Brazil was one of the vaccines developer. Of course, the H1N1 emergency was not as bad as the one that we are living now with COVID-19, but I think it gives us a sense. And HIV, it's another very clear example. We need to remember the 10 million people that have died in the African continent, even after there were medicines available to treat and prevent those deaths from happening. And in terms of hepatitis C, we have a cure now. Hepatitis C is no longer a chronic disease. It's a disease that can be cured, and people just don't have access to the life-saving treatment exactly because of high prices and the inequality in terms of access globally. So moving on to talk about the waiver a little bit, I would like to talk about a little bit of the US announcement, the alleged US support for the waiver. The Indian and South African proposal they wanted to suspend all the intellectual property rights for all health technologies useful for COVID-19. So it was not just patents, it was not just for vaccines. And this is a very important difference, because we can think about just patents. It's one way of of intellectual property protection, a patent, and just for vaccines, which of course are perhaps the most important health technology that we have today to face COVID-19. But at the same time, what India and South Africa are arguing is that we need to suspend a wide range of intellectual property rights, including trade secrets, including data exclusivity, and including other intellectual property rights, in order to all laboratories in the world to engage in producing and distributing technology without being afraid of any intellectual property infringements. And this is very important, because what patents and other intellectual property rights do, they create this kind of cluster, they create this huge barrier, and it's very unclear whether you can infringe a patent or intellectual property right or not. So it's not enough to suspend patents for vaccines and expect that with that, we will increase the number of vaccines that we have available in the world. It is true that we have more potential and we have more capacity to deliver more vaccines now. But it's impossible that we do that right now because of intellectual property rights. So this is a very small number of companies that have created these clusters and non-transparent tech transfer deals and other kind of deals that that control in numerous parts of the production process and impedes other companies to enter this business. Sorry, perhaps I wasn't very clear, but I'm trying to keep on time. Perhaps we can keep our conversation during questions afterwards. And I would like to talk also about Brazil's position, because I think it's very interesting to think about that when thinking about BRICS. I've said that repeatedly, that if you were in the year of 2000 or 1990s, Brazil would table this proposal with India and for South Africa. That's for sure. I can imagine that having Brazil's health diplomacy as it were before being dismantled by Bolsonaro's government, that Brazil wouldn't table this proposal with India and South Africa. And we have to be honest that this proposal didn't go through yet because of Brazil's reluctance to support it and even to engage in negotiations on the India and South Africa proposal. So Brazil is very much responsible for what's going on in the African continent. The disaster that's going on in the African continent, without having vaccines, without having shots to distribute to their own population, health professionals didn't get their shots yet. This is unacceptable. It's a moral disaster in terms of the humankind. And Brazil is very much responsible because Brazil has blocked for several months the negotiations in the World Trade Organization. And this is just one more way that Bolsonaro has his hands full of blood, not only Brazilian blood, but also blood from other countries that desperately needs those vaccines. I'm almost wrapping up, Anna. Please tell me when you have like 2-3 minutes. Another aspect that I would like to raise is that because many people that oppose the TRIPS waiver, which we believe that it's fundamental for tackling COVID-19 in a proper way, And we have to say that immunization is a necessarily collective project. We cannot think as immunizations and as an individual approach. This is totally wrong in every way as possible. So people think, oh no, I got my two vaccines, so now I can go out without masks. No, that's not true. That's not true. It will not be done. We will not be out of this situation until every country is out of this situation. So this is another. It's also ridiculous that rich countries think that they can vaccinate their own populations. Like the UK have shots for like 5 times their population. It's ridiculous in so many ways that I can't even express. But I'd like to talk about this apparent contradiction between tech transfer and the waiver proposal. So people say, oh, we don't need a waiver. We need tech transfer. We need bilateral agreements between companies. And we see this as a very bad approach for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a voluntary approach. So it's up to the companies whether they would transfer the technology or not. And we have a very good example. The WTO, World Health Organization, have put together this CTAP, which was a platform, a pool of technologies, so that the companies could, put their technologies there, and other companies could explore the technologies. And that was in very early in the pandemic, in the first months of the pandemic. And I ask you, how many companies have put their technologies there? None. It just didn't work, because we have also learned from these other health emergencies, HIV, Hep C, that we cannot rely on the goodwill of pharmaceutical corporations. We cannot rely on their goodwill to solve health crises. They profit from health crises, and it's a different modus operandi. So the second reason is because those agreements are not transparent, and we need to have transparency. And the third reason is that because those agreements, they do not necessarily increase production, because we need to have all capacity in the world available to produce vaccines and other health technologies useful for COVID. And those kind of tech transfer deals, they are important, but they are not able to solve the problem on their own. So we need the waiver, and we need the waiver as soon as possible. We cannot have anymore the situation that countries are reaching 70% of vaccine coverage, and other countries don't have not even 1% of vaccine coverage. I'm happy to answer further questions. And again, thank you very much for this opportunity, Ana.
Thank you, Pedro. Really excellent comments. I think that Vish will have something to say about it. But first, Vish, if you allow me, I will also pose some questions, also read the questions from the public. We have about 70 people watching us. Just very quickly from my side, and then I will read some of the public questions. I think that, I've been saying this in every event that we're doing during the pandemic. I think that the pandemic has shown the worst and the best side of BRICS. So if BRICS really cooperate, they can do something. They can work together. They can have vaccines. They can distribute all the equipment necessary to fight the pandemic, like masks and other equipment to produce the vaccines and other. And if they don't, if they're nationalist, selfish, and if they, are against its own people, as Brazil right now is doing, they can really show their worst part. And I think that the topic of geopolitics which is the main topic of our conversation here, is really, really important because, as you said, Vish, China, India, and also partially Russia, they really have acted during this pandemic, looking further, looking beyond the pandemic and seeing how they would, expand and get, a better image, better diplomacy, better market access in many countries in Africa, in Latin America, and looking at the US position at the same time. So it was very clear in the case of China and Russia, and partially in the case of India. Many Brazilians don't know this because the topic of chloroquine, this non-effective medicine that Bolsonaro was trying to push here in Brazil, was heavily produced in India and also heavily exported from India to Latin America. But on the other side, China and Russia have come even closer together to face the US. China has exported a lot of equipment and materials without which we wouldn't have even the most basic equipment and access. And even the new development bank has lent emergency funds to each of the BRICS countries to fight the pandemic. So the best and the worst parts of BRICS were shown. And I wanted to hear from you, as you were saying in your comments in the last slide and in your conclusions, that the BRICS are acting for itself. They have not shown enough another side of what the US has been doing, etc. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate more and explain more the role of China in all of this, because I think that, of course, the political transition in the US was key, and now China is facing another kind of position from the US. What does this mean for Africa? What does this mean for South Africa in particular, and for the African continent in general, because of the now more than 20 years of China-Africa relations and China-Africa cooperation, if we can say. What does this mean now with this change in the US, and the US trying to get closer to African countries, working much more closer to India, even though Obama was already very close to India, Trump a little less, but now Biden again. So in terms of geopolitics and from the perspective of African countries, what is your take on this? And another question that has to do with one question also from the public is the role of Africa itself. Africa has many experiences with epidemics. Africa has a strong CDC. Africa has a strong experience with HIV and the fight against HIV. So what has the continent and the countries done together? Are there any chances for a common struggle? How do you see this? Are there any chances of a common approach towards, one, China, second, the WTO, and third, the G20, if I may say this? I think these are the three key actors. And one last question from my side, and I really promise to be over and then let the public talk. South Africa is back in the IMF. If you can say something about the South African situation in terms of the economics, as far as maybe you can correct me, but as far as I read and I was following, Ramaphosa profited from this liberalization of fast credits. I forgot the name of it, from the IMF. How do you see the economic situation in terms of debt, indebtedness, and the economic recovery of South Africa? So now let me go to the public, and I will try to translate to Portuguese, to English. One first question is in English. How do you tackle neoliberal policies, neoliberal policies, and what is China's role in counterbalancing neoliberal policies? This is questions from Carolina Lessa. Then I have a question from, and maybe both you, Pedro, you can also, if you want, talk a little bit more. From Larissa. Larissa wants to know if the negationist, the nonsense discourses of Bolsonaro about the pandemic is impacting BRICS relations and the relations among BRICS countries. So how did Bolsonaro's discourses are impacting BRICS relations? One question from Anselmo concerns African regional integration projects. He says, so along the 2000s, many initiatives of regional integration in South Africa took place. NEPAD, PIDA, the African Union, Agenda 2063, among others. He would like to know first how COVID-19 is impacting the regional integration progresses. And second, if the regional initiatives have been helping to fight the pandemic. Then one more question, it's a longer one. Philip Mikkel. Okay, no, it's Susie, she's Brazilian, she's a health worker situated in South Africa. She would like to know from Vish, what will be the chance for the South African people to take the vaccine? Are they willing to? Are they resisting to get vaccinated? In Brazil, for example, this negationist position orchestrated by Bolsonaro is helping some people not to get vaccinated. So she would like to know from the perspective of South Africa, what is happening there. She's in South Africa since February and has received that many people don't believe in the vaccine. So there's an anti-vaccine position there too. Okay, and one, sorry, it's a lot. Oh, okay, no, it's the same question. So it's a lot to comment on. So Vish and Pedro, please feel free to comment too. So Vish, please go first.
Okay, yeah, we're definitely going to share this. And thank you to everybody for the comments and engagements. And Pedro, for your input. I mean, I really don't have any disagreement with what you had to say. Just on vaccine hesitancy, to start with that, over 70% of South Africans, and there have been numerous surveys and studies done on this, really want to have the vaccine. And at the same time, there is a trust deficit vis-a-vis the post-apartheid state. In many, many respects, it's a failing state. You know, we have a high unemployment rate at about 42%, extended definition, or 60% youth unemployment rate. We have inequality that's worse than Brazil, and so on. But you also have dysfunctional local government. You have dysfunctional parastatals. You have rolling blackouts around electricity supply, etc. And so there's a deepening systemic crisis in South Africa. So there's a trust deficit vis-a-vis the state. And but yet, on the other hand, you still have this high set of numbers around people wanting the vaccine. There are parts of South African society that are outright anti-vaxxers, like many, many parts of the world. They have deep philosophical opposition to vaccines and so on. That's there. I think the other issue, of course, is the rollout. The rollout, as our colleague or comrade would know, has been kind of up and down in South Africa for various reasons. One being the South African government has been behind the curve in the vaccines early on. It put all its eggs initially in the COVAX basket. It was very naive about the geopolitics of vaccines. But in the end, of course, it's catching up. It's trying to catch up. The rollout also has a whole set of other logistical problems in terms of spread and footprint. There is a public-private partnership, which is saddled with all kinds of issues. There's digital technology being used to register people in the queue, and that's also throwing up several problems. So obviously, this is impacting. But I think the last point I'd make on the vaccine issue, hesitancy, is that we had over 500,000 J&J vaccines administered to healthcare workers as a priority. And that process has been tracked. And particularly now in the context of our third wave, what it is showing is that the majority of healthcare workers have been protected by having the vaccine in the midst of the third wave. Now, this is very, very important for public confidence. Now, similarly, if you look at the United States, in the global South, particularly, actually in the South, sorry, in the United States, where there's a strong anti-vaxxer position, you are seeing high levels of hospitalization, you're seeing high levels of infection. In places like Alberta, Canada, again, there's data coming out. The unvaccinated are the ones that are ending up in emergency units, etc. So we're actually seeing more and more that there's a difference being made if you are vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. And I think that evidence will play itself out. Very quickly around South Africa and the economic situation in the country. I've alluded to the structural crises in South Africa. And, you know, before COVID-19, the South African government was already failing on its own terms in terms of its neoliberal class project. Credit rating agencies has declared it junk status for its bonds, etc. And there was an austerity project kicking in, massive cuts to public healthcare, etc. before the pandemic. Now, this is a very, very serious situation, and we've gone into the pandemic, and the government has continued what I would call epidemiological neoliberalism, and they have adopted a economic reconstruction and recovery plan, which is all about infrastructure inflows, particularly carbon-based lock-ins, more mining and extractivism, offshore gas and oil. It's called a game changer by our president, etc. More mining, and this is the kind of direction. And of course, the austerity budget is all about 300 billion rand cut, particularly to public expenditure. Now, this is in the context in which healthcare workers and other public servants have been at the front line of managing the state response to the pandemic. It's very uncaring. There's a major impasse in public sector negotiations. But the striking thing about this epidemiological neoliberal response of the state is that it is truly uncaring. In South Africa, about 30 million people out of a population of 59 million earn less than the upper bounded poverty line of about 1,280 rands. You know, with high unemployment rates now, people are struggling to put food on the table. So the socio-economic mitigation response of the state has been awful. They kept social grants going. 18 million people depend on this. But because of food inflation, these grants have been eroded. There was a special unemployment relief grant as well, a very minimal amount of money, 350 rand. And that was taken away after a few months because of the austerity agenda of government. And in the third wave, there's been a serious lockdown and more unemployment and more suffering. So there isn't a balance around socioeconomic mitigation. The austerity approach, cutting budgets, etc., is just not what is required in this situation. So our systemic crisis, our crisis of reproduction in South African society is getting worse. And we are coming out of this pandemic actually in a deep, deep crisis. I'll just say one other thing. I mean, there were so many questions and I'm not going to hog the time. And just maybe to say something around China. So David Harvey refers to, sort of China, neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics and a certain specificity about neoliberalism in the context of China. Yes, there's an element of truth to that insight, but China also cannot be reproduced. I think when we're thinking about China, we should not think in what Qingquan Li calls model terms. China is not a model that can be replicated anywhere in the world. It has its own specific political ecology, political economy, if you like. And it's complex. It's shaped by class and popular struggles. It's shaped by conflicts between the central states and provincial states, if you like. It's shaped by sort of the economic trajectories of particular regions, etc. It's a very, very complicated situation. But when everything's said and done, the dominant logic in China is a capitalist logic, a neo-mercantilist logic. And it's very, very self-interested, and it is very, very self-seeking. So in the midst of, if you like, the financial crisis, you've seen it in the context of the dumping of steel, cheap steel, even amongst its BRIC partners. You've seen it in the context of dumping cement. It's not as though China is able to strategically manage the balance of trade, for example, with its partners, and inaugurate a project that is mutually beneficial and that can, if you like, lock in a common accumulation path. That's not what's happening. The terms of trade between even BRICS countries and China is very off, okay? In the context of Africa, I mean, the Chinese agenda, while different from a sort of structural adjustment approach, etc., there has still been a recovery aspect, a cost recovery aspect to how the Chinese engage with African states. A lot of Chinese investment as well is into resources, as we know. It's very much into extractives, you know, whether it's the copper belt, whether it's oil, etc. These are all very calculated strategic investments and flows. And they're all about keeping the juggernaut of Chinese accumulation going. And so it's skewing African economies as well, like it skewed Latin American economies in terms of mono agriculture and exports, etc., to China. So there's a particular division of labor that's been created by the globalizing of Chinese accumulation, which is not necessarily beneficial to countries in the global south. And we have to think this through very, very carefully. Pan-Africanism has been defeated on the African continent. We've had over 3 decades of neoliberalization. And in that context, we have a disciplined Africa, an Africa that is a subject, an imperial subject. That's what we are dealing with here. And so even the regionalization initiatives that have come through, these are very weak. They are not rooted. They are not buttressed by very strong institutions, regulatory regimes, and more importantly, states. So you have, you know, about 54 states on the continent that are, most of whom are lacking in capacities to even govern domestically for a whole host of reasons I've mentioned: structural adjustments, the legacies of colonialism, etc., etc. So you have a very shallow process of regionalization, and you have an African ruling class that is completely, if you like, a product of this globalization. A lot of this is a lumpen elite that doesn't have a vision for a more transformative project. So in that context, yes, there is a history of dealing with pandemics, etc. But when you look more closely, including at Ebola in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and places like that, it was community mobilization also that played a very, very important role. It wasn't just technologies kind of helicoptered in. It wasn't just a narrow biomedical response. It was community involvement that made the difference, and that helped many of these societies kind of turn the corner. So I'm going to stop there, but I think there are lots of issues here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vish. Pedro, do you want to say something about the question, maybe particularly also how Bolsonaro's discourses have been impacting BRICS relations, if you have an idea,
Okay.
and also the other issues?
Yes, for sure. Quick disclaimer: I'm not a BRICS expert, so and being in this space, I don't want to overstep and to make like in-depth analysis. But I think that if we think about not just Bolsonaro's discourse, but his attitude regarding and the relationship that he built with Trump, that certainly undermined the relation with other BRICS countries. So I was I was remembering the other day when I was in a meeting, a face-to-face meeting. That was a long time ago. And Trump had just been elected, and someone in the room, I think it was a Hebrip meeting, and someone in the room said, if Lula was the president, he would be on a plane to Mexico right now. And I think this is the huge discrepancy that we have between a government that is willing to build a global South kind of a global South coalition to deal and to try to counterbalance the global North power. And I don't think we can even call it a diplomacy, the kind of attitude that Bolsonaro had towards the Trump administration. And I think that certainly undermined BRICS. And I think that the fact that Brazil took so long just even to engage in negotiations in the World Trade Organization and being a proposal by India and South Africa that really reflects how the BRICS, the relationships within BRICS were weakened by the Bolsonaro administration. And I would like to talk about a little bit the vaccine hesitancy. And I don't even think we can use this term. I mean, there are no vaccines. How can we even talk about hesitancy? It's outrageous to even use this term. We cannot talk about that. And that, again, I'm repeating myself, and I'm sorry for that. But this kind of discourse was created by global North countries and pharmaceutical corporations, transnational pharmaceutical corporations, to justify the fact that they wouldn't send medicines, anti-HIV medicines, to the African continent because they wouldn't know how to use it. They wouldn't have adhesion to the treatment. I can only think of two words to describe this kind of thinking. It's racist and it's colonial. And it's the same thing with this so-called, I don't even like saying this hesitancy because it's outrageous, but it's the same thing. We can discuss if the countries in the African continent would be able to apply the vaccines, would be able to distribute the vaccines, because the vaccines are not there. And they are not there because there are a small group of corporations who are trying and are controlling the market and shortening the doses, exactly because of what the professor just said, because there are 9 new billionaires in the world. And for these companies, this is what the health crisis is all about. It's about making billions and billions of money and to concentrate the power and to concentrate the wealth and to leave people to die. This is what happened. We have to say it clearly. We have a division in the world power that some people are left to die. Their lives, according to those people, they're worth less than others. So it's for me, I don't think we can even use this term of hesitancy. And if there's hesitancy, it's in the US. There in the US, there is hesitancy because of this, how do you say that? This is fake news spread by Trump and spread by Bolsonaro. Let's see in Brazil when we reach 65% of population vaccinated. My guess is that it's going to be difficult to raise from 65 to 75. That's my bet. because of, how do you say that in English? Negationism, I don't even know. I mean, those fake news spread by Bolsonaro that people would become an alligator if they took a vaccine, or there's a Chinese SIM card that's going to be implanted in your DNA if you take a vaccine. These kind of things create vaccine hesitancy. Shortage of doses create deaths. That's the difference that we have to make. Really. I think I'm going to stop there, Anna.
That's it. Vish, I don't know if you heard about it, but Bolsonaro once said that those who get the Coronavac vaccine in Brazil, which is made by the Chinese Sinovac and the Butantan Institute, would maybe risk to turn into an alligator. So now in the protests in Brazil, people are dressed up as alligators to make fun of him. And of course, all the anti-China discourse along this line. So, well, I think everyone is already tired. It was a big privilege. I'm really, really happy to hear you both and really your critical view on all of this. Pedro, thank you really very, very much. And Vish, it was very special to get all this first-hand information from South Africa, from the African situation, from the continent. I'm very happy that I got you both here to talk about this issue, because it's a really like a main issue that's really, really good. For the public, if you need a certificate on this, please write to our email. This webinar will be available in our YouTube page, and it's also in our Facebook page. Vish, do you want to say a few last words? Maybe I would ask you, just for not to go out very hopeless here, if there was any outcomes out of the Global Assembly that you hold for a few months there.
Yeah. I mean, so we sent the outcomes to the World Trade Organization, the recordings and so on. I mean, we had a great lineup of people, including the Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, was on this platform, and others. And so they wrote back to us. The WTO wrote back to us. They started a dialogue with us, keeping us updated on how the process is unfolding. And we kept on replying and kept on asking about, well, when is the waiver on the agenda and so on. And in the end, that process was overtaken by the Biden administration process. At the same time, there's a whole lot of networks that grew out of that and connections. So various events have been happening in the global north, and many of the organizations on that platform have been invited into those engagements, like this one tonight. So there's been so many sort of spin-offs from that to build solidarity. And I think that's what's important for us going forward. And thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Pedro, do you want to say one last word?
Very quickly, if I may, Anna. In Brazil, internationally, we are discussing the waiver, but in Brazil, we are in the middle of a very important process, which is the discussion of a law bill to make the compulsory license mechanism more suitable to health emergencies. And this is very important. It's a discussion that have been going on in the House of Representatives for, I don't know, a year and a half, since April last year. And it's very close to be voted. So if I may be excused and talk in Portuguese just for a few seconds. Se quem estiver vendo a gente puder entrar em vacinaparatodas.redesolidaria.org.br para mandar e-mail para os parlamentares, pressionar os líderes partidários para que a gente vote esse projeto, vai ser muito importante. Né? E quem puder postar nas redes sociais também, hashtag A Vida Pede Licença, para uma melhor lei de licença compulsória, nós do TTP agradecemos muito. So just to quick translate to the professor, we have a public campaign here in Brazil. Of course, it's an online campaign to make the compulsory license mechanism better in Brazil and more suitable to health emergencies. So Caroline, it's not an email, it's a website, vacinaparatodos.redesolidaria.org.br. In the website, it's very easy to find how to pressure congressmen and women. Anna, again, thank you so much for this invitation. It's been a privilege to me to be part of this panel. And of course, I am available anytime. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Pedro. I just want to say thank you also to both translators. These are students, English Portuguese students at PUC-Rio. So Maria, Thomas, thank you very much. And of course, the BPC team, Lia, Luana, and everyone for organizing this. Vish and Pedro, you know BPC is open. It's a space for you too. Please call us, ask us, be here. It will be a great pleasure to have you again. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you, Maria, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vish. Thank you,
Good
Pedro.
night.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Tchau.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, pessoal.